thanks everyone for joining this Supply Chain Sustainability School Lunch and Learn today on the Biodiversity Net Gain and the metric version 3. Really pleased to have Julia Baker, who is Technical Director of Biodiversity at Wood, who's going to be leading the session for us today. So I'll hand over to her in just a moment. Before I do, a couple of really quick housekeeping points. We've got a large audience today, so cameras and mics are all switched off, but you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you've got any questions for Julia throughout the session. So just post them through in the Q&A and we'll get back to them at the end. We'll also be asking for your feedback at the end as well, so please do share that with us. It's really useful with the number of sessions we run to continuously improve. But I'm going to hand over to Julia now. Thanks very much, and I'll speak to you all at the end. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this session on the Biodiversity Metric version 3.0. So let's start off with the background, the context, right? So we now have the Environment Act 2021, and we've got about a 2-year transition period when we're going to get more information about the secondary legislation, and then the Act will come into force. Now, this is just a kind of a screen grab from what's on the website. And if you look at this, okay, so part 6, nature and biodiversity, biodiversity gain and planning. So biodiversity gain, biodiversity net gain will be a condition of planning permission. So development projects going through seeking planning permission that have a mandatory requirement to generate net gains in biodiversity. What's interesting is 99, and 99 was a bit of a late addition. So biodiversity net gain will also apply to the big stuff, the nationally significant infrastructure projects. So we're looking at both development projects going through planning permission and the NSIPs as well. So the starting point, I guess, is, well, what is biodiversity net gain? And the definition by DEFRA is development that leaves the natural environment in a measurably better state than before. So the measurably, that's going to be the focus of today. But I just want to highlight really what that means. And if you've heard me talk before, you might have heard me talk about this, because while I love the metric and while the metric's really important, and we'll come to the details of the metric, we do have to stand back and get perspective about truly what's the ambition here. And the ambition is development is the driving force of a healthy and thriving natural environment. Development is the thing that leaves the natural environment in a better state than what it found it. And that is a shift change. That's a complete gear change of what we've got at the moment when development's given consent with an amount of biodiversity loss. So it's that whole transition, and the metric's only one part of helping us get to that transition, but it is an important part because you're looking at measurable outcomes. So what do we know about the mandatory approach at the moment? Well, a couple of things. One is the 10%. So this is the wording: a development's biodiversity value exceeds the pre-development biodiversity value of on-site habitat by at least 10%. So basically what that means is you measure your baseline, and at the end of the development you have to have a minimum of an uplift 10% in biodiversity units, and that's where the metric comes in, and we'll come to that. But it's a minimum 10%. That's the numerical definition of biodiversity net gain. And the biodiversity value will be measured by the metric, which we'll get into, secured for at least 30 years. So right at the start on development projects, when the mandatory approach comes in, we've got to start thinking about budgets and program for that 30-year timeline. And we can achieve biodiversity net gain on-site, off-site, or there'll be a kind of a backstop, if you like, where developers will be able to purchase credits from, well, what will be a government body at the time. But it's the measurement that's most important. And at the moment, what we have is the biodiversity metric version 3.0. And that will be the topic of today. I know that very soon version 3.1 will be published. My understanding is that the changes are not massive. It's more in terms of clarity around the tools and particular aspects of metric 3. And a few tiny tweaks. So what I go through today should be the mainstay of what you'll see in version 3.1. And version 3.1 is published in response to a consultation Natural England ran on version 3. So keep a track. It should be published very soon. But the common themes and everything that I'm going to talk about today will certainly apply to version 3.1. One thing that I really like what Natural England have done, so if you go into the user guide of the metric, you'll come across A, principles, and B, rules. There are rules to using the metric, and Natural England have been incredibly clear about this. And our job in industry is A, let's adhere to the rules, and B, demonstrate with evidence how we've done that. So it's not just a wafty thing that there are principles lying around. It's pretty clear cut from Natural England, and a part of getting consent is not about, okay, here's the metric and you can see that 10% uplift. No, it's about here's the metric, here's how we've used it and applied it in accordance with the rules and the principles. And I'll keep coming back to this point because the metric is only a tool. Net gain design has to be underpinned by really good and strong ecological principles, and the metric has to be applied in a very specific context as a tool to help the net gain design. It doesn't answer all the questions about net gain. That is in the hands of the ecologist, and it has to be applied appropriately, just like any tool. You know, there is a version of what does good look like, and Natural England have set this out pretty clearly. Just to highlight a couple of things that I think is quite important. There's no change to existing legislation. So it's not like we're suddenly bypassing great crested newts or forgetting about dormice or bats. That all is still part of the deal through development. So there's a solid piece of work there according to existing protection for wildlife, and then the net gain is like this umbrella that sits above that, and that's when we do that mitigation, and then we generate these net gain outcomes for biodiversity. And this one as well, this one is really important. So metric calculations help the net gain design. The net gain design is in the hands of the ecologist. It's a tool to help inform decision making, and I think used rightly, used appropriately, it is really important tool, but it cannot answer every single question that we want answered under the net gain design. And I'll come back to that point about the mitigation hierarchy as well, because I think metric has a really interesting play there. But the context of the metric, what it is intended to do, and most importantly, what it's not intended to do, is really important to make sure that we're running these net gain designs, delivering them according to best practice, but also in terms of what makes sense for both a development and the natural environment. And this all sits underneath our good practice principles. And this was back in 2016, where as an industry, collaborating with local government, with national government, with NGOs, with local planning authorities, collectively, we looked at biodiversity net gain right back in the early days and said, okay, people are working on net gain on a voluntary basis at the time. What does good look like? And these are principles that underpin the whole net gain approach. Now, they relate very, very closely to the principles in the metric, but what I want to point to is principle number 5. So number 5 is make a measurable net gain contribution. And if you see that, okay, there's 10 principles. Number 5 has 2 parts. One is measurable, so there you go, there's the metric, but there's another part as well about making a contribution, which is when the net gain actually makes a contribution to the ambitions for nature in that particular locality. So in essence, in terms of these good practice principles, the metric is 1/2 of one principle that sits along 10 principles. So I'm hoping that you'll get a sense of actually there's this whole package of tools in the tool bag for net gain, and the metric's only one of them. It's not here to answer all the questions. It's not here to design net gain. It's an important part, yes, but it's not everything. And you know, my friend recently bought a Skoda, lovely car, lovely. But it's like my mate bought a Skoda and then got slightly annoyed that it wasn't winning Formula One. You know, and I hear these discussions about the metric, and it's like, well, you know, the metric isn't here to solve the biodiversity crisis. The metric isn't here to do everything on biodiversity net gain. The metric is one tool in the tool bag that we've got for net gain. So as we go through this, as much as I love the metric, I always come back to that point. It's about using the metric appropriately and using all the other tools that we have to generate net gain outcomes. Well, let's focus on the metric, right? So some of you might not know how the metric works. So I thought that this would be hopefully a useful understanding. Now, how the metric works, the ecologists go out and collect survey data on habitats. And the metric is based on different information about a habitat. And that might be the type of habitat, the condition that it's in, the size, the locality, all those things. So the ecologist will go out and collect all this data. You run it through the metric, and what the metric does is it scores those various parts of those habitats, and then it comes out with biodiversity units at the end of it. It's just a proxy indicator. The interesting point here, though, is when you run it through the metric has 3 boxes, and you either put habitats in the green box, in the brown box, or the blue box. Now, the green box, what we call these area-based habitats. So these are habitats that you measure in areas. So it might be a woodland, a grassland, and you'll have a certain number of hectares. The brown box are the hedgerows and line of trees. So those are linear habitats that you'll measure in length. So you'll have a kilometre length for that. And then the blue box are rivers, like it shows there. So at the end of the baseline, what you have is before work, so your baseline, you'll have your area-based units, the green stuff, the linear units, the brown stuff, and then you'll have your river units. The moment that you have that, a really, really good trick is to calculate what that 10% looks like. Now, the green has its own 10%. The brown box has its own 10% target. And yes, you've guessed it, the rivers have their own 10% target as well, and you can't mix and match. It's not a pick and mix. You can't swap and change. You can't have 5% of your brown box, 5% of your green box, and say, oh, look, overall, we got a 10%. It doesn't work like that. Green, brown, and blues each trigger their own 10% requirements. And if you calculate your 10% target, the moment that you've got your baseline, it gives a sense of clarity for the developers, for the development teams, for planning, for budgeting, for programming, right at an early stage. And what that does is that you're really embedding Net Gain into the design of the project, into the planning, into the budgeting, which is exactly where it should be. If you leave this bit too late, when budgets are already set, when you've already got a program, it's really hard and tricky to retrofit this stuff in, particularly for budgets and things like that. So the moment that you have a baseline, even if it's a kind of a rough guess from aerial imagery, and I'll come to the advantages of doing that at the moment, is the moment that you can start, okay, this is the net gain, this is the direction of travel, this is what we've got to work from. And that's a really, really useful conversation to start with. Okay, well, let's go back to how the metric works. So the ecologist has gone out, surveyed the habitats, come in, run it through the metric, and we've got the green, the brown, and the blue, the baselines. You'll then go through the on-site design and what habitats can we avoid? Can we minimize the impacts? What's going to be created? What's going to be enhanced? And in the metric, that looks like that. So you have your on-site post-development, and you can see the boxes there. So you have your green box for creation and enhancement, your browns and your blues as well. So again, the metric behind the scenes is running through all these data, and then at the end of it, it will say, right, so post-development, these are your units. So you've got your area-based units, your linear units, and your river units. And all the metric does is simply take the difference between your baseline habitats and the post-works habitats. And have you achieved that minimum uplift of 10%? And hopefully you can see now why I kind of started off by saying the metric is only a tool to use to guide the design, but the design has to be based on strong ecological thinking and principles, because at the end of the day, it's only a tool that runs the numbers. But what's actually going to work on site, what's going to be feasible on site, and how does the habitat work on site? That has to be down to the ecologist working very closely with the project team. But the question is, well, have we achieved 10%? If we haven't, the metric has an option to go off-site. So you do the same, collect your habitat data on the baseline, run it through, and the off-site post-development as well. And the metric will run through all of this and point to the afterworks picture of, okay, well, have we achieved the 10%? So in a very simplistic way, that's how the metric works. It's based on habitat data. run it through the metric, get your baseline, calculate that 10% target as early as possible. It really helps planning, it really helps budgeting, it really helps the direction of travel with the design. Run through the design on site and where are we, what's best for nature, what's possible with the design, what's feasible, what's practical, and then do we need an offsite, yes or no. Now, I've kind of touched on this, but this is really where I think the metric comes into fore. It's such a great communication tool. You know, I work across the board with project managers, with people in commercial, with QSs, QAs, section engineers, project directors, MDs, and every single time the metric really helps my communication of, okay, what does net gain mean for the project? What's best for biodiversity? What's the best outcomes for the project? So if you can use it as early as possible, it's a great communication tool, and it really helps embed the thinking of net gain into the design. And the screenshot that you got there, that's from the headline results in the metric. So you can quickly see, okay, on-site baseline, 24 units, on-site post in development, so that's after works, 24.95. okay, we're only 3%. Right at an early stage, that's invaluable information, because it's like, okay, Julia, we're not there at 10%. Can we start that thinking? Yes, we can. You know, and if you leave that too late, again, it's really hard and it's probably unnecessary time and cost to retrofit that in. If you use the metric as early as possible, chances are that you're using limited data. So I do say there's a but that comes with this. You've got to clarify your data limitations, you know, because there will be a time when you go out on site, you collect more refined data and the numbers will change. So be really clear that this is a very early estimate. It's just a direction of travel, and, you know, you can work on that basis. What I also do, which I find quite helpful, is I say, well, look, right here, right now, I've just checked Google Maps. It's an early estimate. In May and June, the team will go out there, collect survey data, we'll have the revised metric in July, you know, so people have that program, okay, this is when I'm going to get the metric revision. And the other thing that I do, I mean, I put the 3% there as just an example, but when you give an early estimate, sometimes it depends on your audience or who you're speaking to. Sometimes it's actually better to give a numerical range. So if I've run this early estimate and I can see, oh gosh, we're only at 3% at this kind of concept stage of the design, I'd probably tell the design team that, okay, the current design, it looks like it's between a 3 and a 5% outcome, or a 2 and a 4% outcome. So I'm giving them a range rather than a single number. And I only say that because I used to give people that, okay, that's the number, that's 3% early on, and people cling on to that number. I mean, literally, they will hang on to that number no matter how many times I said it's an early indicative estimate. And I had this on one project. I was like, well, it's 50 units that we need. The metric was refined, it was updated, and actually I think we needed 62 units. But it was like months later that Ed came back to me and said, Julia, right in the early days, you said 50. I'm like, that was an early estimate. So use the metric early by all means, but just be really careful in the communication. It's about getting the net gain thinking into the design, enabling people to plan and budget for net gain, but being careful in terms of the work that you need to get a more accurate metric result. Let's come back then to this 10%. So you've got your baseline, really early stage of the design. You say, right, I've calculated these are the 10% target. So here's your baseline. That's the minimum uplift to 10%. And you can graph this out. You can create, you know, dashboards, whatever you think is going to be a really good communication tool. The next really good point about the metric that's very handy is this. So DEFRA's published research led by the brilliant FTech that on average, it looks like, and this is really on average, if you want to question the research, it is published on DEFRA's website. It looks like the cost per biodiversity unit is 20 grand. That makes a difference. That makes a difference whether your 10% target is 5 units or 50 or 500. That's going to make a real difference. So right at the early stage, you can say that's our 10% target. If all else fails, and this is the units that we need, you can put an indicative price based on that published figure by DEFRA. And again, this is about using the metric as a tool to embed net gain thinking into the design to enable people to plan and budget for it as early as possible. That's not just business sense, it's going to lead to better outcomes for nature as well. One of the things though that I really recommend that you do is look at the area of temporary works. So you know, I've been on so many construction projects and construction sites. Now these are areas of temporary works where we come in, we build a compound or haul roads or temporary drainage. We're there on major projects, it might be 4, 5, even 6 years. When temporary works leave, the deal is that we reinstate the land as it was. Now to date, that has been a simple one-to-one reinstatement, not under net gain, because the metric factors in that loss of biodiversity over that time period. So one-to-one is not enough. You'll need more than one-to-one. And what you can do to help the construction team plan and minimize that cost as much as possible, run the metric on early construction designs on the temporary work footprint, look at the deficit in units from that. Is it 10 units? And then you can put a price to that. It's incredibly useful, and it really moves this vague concept of, well, there might be dormice or, you know, whatever that is, into the heart of the budgeting and programming of the project, and the metric helps with that. Now look, as a construction member for many years, biodiversity is only one part of the thinking or the issues that construction teams have to work with, and I've worked with construction teams, I really get that. You know, they've got local neighbourhoods, they've got dust, they've got noise, they've got the farming community, but we can help them look at the financial impact as well as the biodiversity impact of the temporary works footprint. Mitigation hierarchy. So I mentioned this pretty briefly, and this is principle 1 of our good practice principles, and it's also firmly embedded in the principles that Natural England published for the metric. It's pretty simple. It's just a series of 4 steps. You start off with avoiding biodiversity loss as much as possible. And I mean, I typically work on energy or transport projects. We always have such a tight working footprint that avoidance is tricky. So you're looking for avoiding where you can and prioritize what you avoid, avoiding the really important aspects of biodiversity. You then go to minimize the loss before you get to remediation and compensation. And at the end of that process, that's when you get your 10% uplift and your net gains. Now, this is the interesting point in the metric, is that it really helps with that. So firstly, this is a screenshot from the metric, and you can see your habitat type there. So we've got a broad habitat, we've got grassland, we've got lowland meadow, and the size. It's this bit here. So one of the interesting scoring aspects of a habitat that the metric does is called distinctiveness. And this is a very high distinctive habitat. It's the highest that you can get, it's very high. The moment a very high distinctiveness habitat is in the metric, it pops up with this: any loss unacceptable, bespoke compensation likely to be required. This is such an interesting play by Natural England, because they've assigned very high distinctiveness habitats as pretty special, so special that any loss is unacceptable. Now, it was a site, it was last year. The team were running on the site, they were doing the habitat surveys, and I got a call from Mike, and he goes, Julia, we're pretty sure this is a very high distinctiveness habitat. And we talked it through. The team got back to the office, we ran through the habitat identification checks, and yes, it was. We immediately got hold of our client, got him on Teams, and showed him how the metric works and how it works in terms of this any loss unacceptable, bespoke compensation. That was enough. That was enough for that particular developer to say, okay, we're going to need to change the working footprint here. And it was early enough that there was time and space in the design program to do so. And he did that because he didn't want that, you know, bespoke compensation, the time and cost of that. It's much better to retain that ecological habitat. And then actually we look to enhance that habitat, which great outcome. So the metric helps, particularly with the mitigation hierarchy, but it really helps. And if anyone's an ecologist on the call, my advice, get to know the very high distinctiveness habitats, really get to know them, get really familiar with them. And the moment that you have one, the moment is that you pick up the phone to your client and your developer and you say, okay, let's try and work out how can we avoid and how can we minimize the impacts here. Okay, so this is the most frequently asked question about the metric. You know, whenever I speak to people about the metric, and there's a really good actually book, well, it's a page on or I guess a group on Facebook. So if you're interested in this, look out for the Biodiversity Net Gain group on Facebook. But people post questions there whenever I speak to people. The most frequently asked question is, what type of habitat should I enter into the metric? It's like, well, hang on, that's not a question for the metric. That's actually a question for habitat classification. So we've got to make sure that, and I'm speaking about myself as an ecologist as well, we're really, really good, much better than we've ever been on habitat surveys, habitat classification. So this is before you enter the data into the metric. Get, you know, as much as you can early doors, but when you get out on site, it's all about identifying habitats. Now, the metric is based on UK HABs, and a shout out to UK HABs. They run really good training courses. There's an app. They've got kind of translation tools between phase 1, which was an old habitat classification, and UK HABs as well. There's a fantastic amount of information about UK HABs. There are a few tweaks between UK HABs and the metric, and it's a bit small, but if you dive into the technical data tab in the metric, it will highlight the exact translation between phase 1 UK HAB and then how that works in the metric. I cannot stress enough, people who rush this bit always trip up later down the line. I've even had ecologists kind of talk to me about surveys that they've done. They haven't quite identified the right habitat, and they've realized it too late to then go back to site, and you know, we can't work like that. It's really, really worth investing the time and the skills in making sure that we've got the right skills and capabilities for really good habitat classification, and most importantly, having that time on site to identify habitats, because that's the starting point of the metric. And you know, this is another screenshot of the metric. So you start by understanding your broad habitat type, then you get into your specific habitat type. And some of you might have been familiar with version 2 of the metric. So version 3, the interesting one is that there's more cropland and urban habitats. There's greater variety of those, and I think that's a definite advantage. Ditches was the green box, but now that's in the blue box. So ditches are now under rivers. So you know this by now, if you have anything in that blue box, if you have a ditch on site, you know that's going to trigger a 10% in your blue box, which is quite an interesting one. And the earlier that you can factor that, is the earlier that you can plan and budget for that. Rivers, they do need specialist input. There's really good courses run by Lucy at the Charles Institute of Ecology, so look out for those. She also gave a really good talk at the last conference run by the Charles Institute of Ecology as well. I think there's a small fee, but you can watch that recording. So if you go onto their website, and she was at the end of the day, but it's a really good talk with her. They do need specialist input for the metric though. There's now a condition assessment for urban trees. So in version 2, we had street trees. Now we've got urban trees, pretty much the same thing. But there's a condition assessment for urban trees now. And watch out, there are certain habitats that are just fixed at poor condition. So bramble scrub being one of them. So you've got a lot of bramble scrub on your site. You don't need the condition assessment. It's fixed at poor condition. So those are the kind of tweaks that Natural England have got into the metric. And there is a new condition sheet. So the difference between version 2 and coming into version 3 is that the condition sheet, I think, is much better, but it's new. And anything that is new means that we've got to have the right skills and capabilities behind this. But it's all about habitats, you know, and I just think we're getting into a much better place in industry. You know, understandably, the way that policy and legislation has kind of siloed us into thinking about, okay, bats, dormice, great crested newts, reptiles, you know, and you do get those projects that manage to step back and think about the whole. But when you're focusing on habitats, it's the ultimate build it and they will come approach. So while the ecologists, while the technical specialists out there need to get into this level of understanding, you know, for those who need to take a step back and understand this is about habitats, you know, this is really where net gain is. And another little handy hint that I've got, plan your digital data. honestly, the amount of frustrating talks that I've been on about GIS not talking to CAD, or not talking to another model, or GIS not talking to GIS. I'm not a GIS expert, and so I do get lost in those meetings. I just need to know that it needs to work. And so one of the first things I do really early doors in the project, okay, what digital data are we going to use to map habitats, and does that work? Does that work with other people as well? And I mean, these are just two examples. You know, you can go cheap and cheerful. We inserted the PDF onto Google Earth. It was great. You know, we inserted it in there, and that's a form of digital data. The engineers at the time could work with that. Or you can go more high tech. So the image at the bottom right there's the most incredible drone footage that they could 3D map the habitats. You know, it's great. We could really include that in the design of the projects. So the design really embraced this kind of concept that net gain is about habitats, and what can we avoid, what can we enhance, what can we retain, where we're going to create these habitats. So digital data have those discussions right from the start. Is it GIS? Is it CAD? Is it BIM? Who's collecting the habitat data? Who's going to use it? One of the things that's interesting is that when you're applying for consent, it might be planning permission, it might be DCO. What do you need to include? Is it just the metric, or do you need to include the digital raw data as well? So think ahead, and certainly the handover from design to your contractor to the maintainer, there should definitely be a handover of that raw digital data from one to the other. So plan that, think ahead, don't leave those discussions to the last minute, because then it's this scrabbling around and compensation events and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. Whereas if you plan this right from the beginning, it leads to much better outcomes. And if anyone is a contractor on the call, you might need as-built data for an as-built metric. So as-built data is as we've built it, basically. That's different from the typical as-built data that we would collect as a contractor. So normally we'd get, you know, a kind of a sheet line of habitat clearance, or the amount of the number of trees that have been planted. That's not what you need for a metric. So it's really worth asking the question, am I expected to produce an as-built metric at the end of construction? And okay, what as-built data do I need for that? So we're getting now into moving from the baseline. Collected the habitat data, we know it's about habitats, so we know that point about, okay, identifying habitats is really important, and we can set those net gain targets really early on. To design and direct the design, and this is where it really comes into, okay, this bit here in the metric, creation and enhancement. Now, one thing that's really important for if anyone is an ecologist on the call, or for those who work with ecologists, okay, what data do you need and where are you going to get that? So sometimes it will be the construction program for the areas that they need to clear for construction, or they might need to save it. Sometimes it will be part of the engineering design or the architect design. Sometimes it will be the landscape design. Rather than leave that last minute, because this is the data that the metric use, it's really worth having the discussions from the start, listing out your data requirements for this stage in the metric. Habitats retained, habitats enhanced, habitat clearance, habitat creation. You know, just list them out and think, okay, who and what format of the data can I get this in? And then it makes the whole thing much more efficient when you run through the metric. And this is another interesting play, and one of the differences between version 2 and version 3 of the metric. When you do get to a stage, and I work on major projects, so there is an element of avoiding the habitats that we can, and then replanting. There's a point in the metric that accounts for the time it takes for new planting to become established habitat. It's called the time to target condition, and that time period is set in years. And the old metric just said, okay, well, if you plant this habitat today, how many years is it going to take to get in that, to get in the target condition? And that might be 30 years or 20 years, whatever that might be. Okay, so this is the interesting point under metric 3, is that we're now factoring in how early or how late that habitat creation is. So if you've cleared your habitat and you landscape, then, or even if you landscape before you've cleared your habitat, you won't be penalised as much. You'll always be penalised because there's always going to be time for the habitat to become established, but you're reducing how much you are. But if you clear your habitat, you've then got to do your works. And again, major projects, you know, we might be there for 4 to 6 years. Then you replant after that 6 years. You're then in the delay box and you get more, you get a higher penalty basically. This makes a difference to the numbers. So we ran, my colleague Izzy, we ran a sense check on the difference between version 2 and version 3 under the metric. And one of the factors that caused the most difference in the metric was this. So this is going to be quite a significant point, and it's really difficult. I mean, you know, when you're building a major project, you simply don't have the space to landscape in advance. I think where this will come in is for those projects who need a biodiversity offset, and when we have an offset market up and running, you might get a habitat bank that's already started planting. So I think there's an interesting you know, kind of starting pilot flame, if you like, that this metric might kickstart the offset market, because there will certainly be the demand and the need by the developers for habitat banks if they're going for an offset, for habitat banks that are already established, because they won't be penalised as much. So do watch out for this in the metric, and again, use it. You can run these metrics early and you can play around with this time to target conditional, think, well, how much is that penalty? How much is it going to cost? We've got the figure of 20 biodiversity units, 20,000 units per, sorry, £20,000 per biodiversity unit. So you can really see the financial impact of when you plant your habitats. Right. So version 3, version 2 had this to some extent, but not as clear. So one of the things in version 3 is it's looking, I don't like the word trading at all, but for simplicity, for simplicity, you have your distinctiveness group of habitats, and essentially you cannot trade down. So if you have a very high or a high habitat, you can't replace it with a low or medium. You cannot trade down. So Natural England here set out a trading rule, and we've touched on this. We know very high is bespoke compensation likely required. If you have a high distinctiveness habitat, look at the trading rule. Same habitat required. I mean, that's pretty clear. There's no ifs, there's no buts, there's no maybes. Same habitat required. So if I have a woodland that's high distinctiveness, Mr. Developer, same habitat required if you're going to clear that. You get further down the line and you get more flexibility. But this is the thing with version 3, is that it pops up with that. That's really simple for anyone going through a metric in consent to see, is that green or is that red? That's red, Julia, you've got to go back and redo that. We're not accepting that. So this is a really good point of the metric. It makes the trading summaries much easier for A, fast lot development to see, are we on track? But B, for those in consent, the regulators, to see, is this metric up to scratch? It might show a numerical 10%, but the trading rules have not been met. And this is you'll see this in the metric in the results page. It is super easy for anyone to look at that and say, hang on, no, go back to the drawing board. So this is why if you use the metric really early, you can use it in a much better way to streamline the design. And if anyone is technical and slightly geeky like myself, these are kind of the brilliant part of the trading. So this is in the technical data tab of the metric. Just go in there, and honestly, this is an entire afternoon. On the left, you'll find your hedge baseline, and running across, these are all the different types of habitats that you can have post-development and what you can trade and what you can't. So the metric gives you not only the simplicity of yes or no, but also it helps you along the way to make these design decisions. But I guess coming back to this point is, while there is a complexity to the metric, and while there needs to be that integrity of the ecological design, if you feel like you're getting slightly lost in that or losing your way, come back to this point. There's only 2 ways to achieve net gain. You are either going to create more habitats than you had to start with, or make existing habitats better. And then what the metric can't give you is, where is that space to put them? So yes, the metrics are a tool, and yes, we need to think about all the trading rules and the mitigation hierarchy. But this is where the metric says, okay, ecologists, over to you. You need space. You need space for nature. You need space for habitats to thrive and grow. And that comes down to the design. You know what's interesting though? I mean, I always get, okay, Julia, this has to be big and fancy. It's going to be really costly. It doesn't have to be. And to run through a really quick example, this was just a SUD improvement plan. You know, they were overgrown, they were pretty degraded. And we got in contact with a developer when they'd already had the SUDs design. And they were quite interested in net gains. They asked us to run it through the metric, and, you know, the design, it kind of looked quite good. So we ran it through the metric, and they hadn't done anything special for net gain. So there was this point about, okay, do nothing for net gain. They used a basic amenity wetland grassland mix, and it was a minus 8.5. So they were saying, okay, well, could you do something? We're like, well, I think we can change the seed mix. I think we can get a better outcome. So we did so. We worked with the local nursery, who were great, actually gave us some really good advice. We ran that through the metric. So the only thing we changed was the seed mix. And at no extra cost, we moved them from a -8 to a +5. So yes, there's more work to get to the minimum 10% uplift, but it does come back to good design, and that's not the job of the metric, that's our job. The other thing that the metric does really well is that it brings into play core conservation thinking. So as a conservationist, when you look at a landscape, you're actually looking for habitats that are essentially valuable for conservation, but possibly degraded, down and out, kind of worn out, basically. And you apply the restoration principle. So, you know, we live in a degraded environment, and as conservationists, you want to restore nature, and it's conservation through restoration. This works really well in the metric, because what you're doing is that you're taking existing habitat, you're avoiding impacts, and you're working through enhancement, and you clock up the numbers really quickly. Now, it's got to work for the development, and it's got to work for, you know, according to trading rules and things like that. But if you do get that opportunity, and I particularly love species poor or defunct hedgerows, you know, that's just a joy, you know, in terms of what we can do with net gain, because that's exactly in line with conservation principles. The metric supports that. It really supports that kind of emphasis in the thinking. So do watch out for the degraded habitats, the down and outs that are inherently valuable for conservation. Bring them under active conservation management, and you will see a jump in units. But I guess I know that's been a whistle-stop tour of the main points of version 3 of the metric. I hope it's been helpful. What I would say is, you know, and I can see we've got some questions coming in, so let's jump to the questions, is watch this space. The Chartered Institute and I are teaming up, so we're going to be running bespoke metric courses. There already are great courses out there. So you've got habitat condition assessment courses on the Chartered Institute for Ecology, so CIEM, and go into UK HABs as well. They do the introduction of UK HAB practitioners, they touch on UK HABs and Biodiversity Net Gain as well. So for those who are interested in more, there's certainly more training out there. But I hope that was useful. And Sophie, should we run through the questions?
Yes, thanks very much, Julia. I've got quite a few questions, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. The first one, well, there's a couple of questions around planning and kind of the consequences for not achieving net gain in planning. So first one, will the biodiversity metric be required to be supplied on all planning applications for development? And are there any defined consequences for not achieving the net gain? Does this become a breach of planning? And then kind of tied into that as well, will planning consent be refused if the 10% net gain is not achieved? And will actions, plans to achieve the net gain become planning conditions that will need to be discharged within a given timescale?
Okay, so we don't have the secondary legislation with the details yet. So we've only got the headlines, if you like, of what might be possible. And at the moment, the Environment Act has gone through consultation that finished on the 5th of April. So we're waiting for that level of detail for the government. What I can say is, from what we know at the moment, yes, net gain will be mandated as part of planning permission. So yes, it will be required to obtain planning consent. But that's why, A, we've got if you get net gain early thinking, it doesn't have to be big and fancy. Achieve it through good design. What it should do is kickstart the offset market. So do what you can on site. And already there's some interesting moves with the offset market. So you could purchase offset units, if you like, and see the government have talked about this backstop. So as a lot, and you'd have to justify it, but as the last possible option, you'd have to buy those, and they're going to be pretty expensive, but buy those credits from the government. But that would have to be justified. You can't just, ignore net gain and pay a check afterwards. So from what I know at the moment, but watch this space when we get more details, yes, it would be mandated to be planning. Yes, I'd imagine it would be a planning condition to discharge, and the options will be on-site, off-site, or you can buy credits from the government.
Great, thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. And then a few questions about the 20k per BU that you mentioned. One person just asking, what are you referring to, just to clarify what BU it's referring to, and then do you have a link that shows the methodology that calculated that number, or do you know where that kind of methodology came from? And does the 20k include management for 30 years, or is it just the initial purchase?
Yeah, so sorry to have clarified. So biodiversity units is the generic term of units for the metric. So you've either got your green box, your brown box, or your blue box, and they're all biodiversity units. Your green box are your habitat area units, brown box are your linear units, and your blue box are your river units. But the generic term for that is biodiversity units, a BU. So sorry, I should have clarified that. So it's an average, and obviously it will vary. And the more that you can invest in good design is, to be frank, that the cheaper it will be. And that's why the SUDS example I always show, because it was at no extra cost. It was simply through good design. I'll send a link, Sophie, to you, if that's okay, of where the research paper is from DEFRA, and the report comes with 2 appendices, and they're actually pretty detailed. They list out the various costs that they had at the time. I think it was 2020 that they came out, so it certainly hasn't accounted for the massive rise in inflation that we've got over the last couple of months. So you've got to take it on that basis. But the report and the appendices will go through what they had, the information that they had, the assumptions that they have to make. And yes, it accounted for, I'm pretty sure it accounted for the 30-year timeline as well. But Sophie, I'll send you the link, and if anyone's interested, you can, I guess, post it out.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we can send that round in the follow-up as well. Next up, just from Emily, on do you have any examples, or what examples of habitats are very high distinctive, and is habitat distinctiveness subjective? So subjective. So could 2 different assessors differ in their designation?
Oh yeah, great question. Well, Lola Meadow, I think that was the one I showed. Question, you're testing my knowledge of metric now. is the one that I most commonly come across. So it's the one that I always use in terms of the example. But if you go into the metric and just there's a couple of buttons that you can pick on. Sophie, I can send you a screenshot so you can post out. It's really easy to find them in the metric. So those very high distinctiveness habitats, always just look out for them. But Lola Meadow is one of them. But Sophie, I'll send you a screenshot rather than me having a bit of a guess now. This is about the point, right? It's about the point of identifying habitats. We've got to get that habitat identifying part right, because if one surveyor goes to site and says that's a very high distinctiveness habitat, but someone else goes to site and says no, that's a high distinctiveness habitat, it makes a massive difference. And the consequences or implications for developers are huge between any loss unacceptable and same habitat required. So it's subjective in the way that it comes down to a really good UK habitat classification, and that depends on skills and competencies. And that's why do go into the UK Hab website. Their training courses are brilliant, and I think it's really good challenge for us as an industry to make sure that we're trained to do the job.
Perfect, thanks. We've had a few questions come in now about offsite credits. So do offsite credits count the same as on-site, and how far away can they be done? Can they be done anywhere?
Yeah, you get penalized. So the metric adds in these contingency factors, which basically increases the amount of units that you need the further away that you go. So the metric has what's called a spatial risk. So if you're, pretty close to your development, or if you're within your local planning authority, or if you're outside your local planning authority, it will add penalties to you. So just purely from a business point of view, you don't want to go too far. Because this is now part of the consenting process, and DEFRA has promised to boost ecology resources within local planning authorities. So obviously we'll see how that goes. But on the assumption that a local planning authority ecologist will be reviewing the integrity of the metric and the net gain design, if he suddenly sees, well, hang on, you've cut down these trees over here and you're building a forest in Wales, you know, that's not going to work from an ecology point of view. So even to get through consent, you've got to marry up the metric as a tool, but the design of net gain has to be based on strong ecological justification. You know, and that you just don't separate the two. It's just not worth it. And I've seen that happen already. So it's certainly worth bearing that in mind, but also how the metric works in terms of where you go offsite. What I would say is on-site is not always the best solution, especially if you're squeezing habitats into a really, really busy housing development, or, you know, supermarket, or whatever that might be. There is a point about mitigating compensation and looking at a good design for nature. But sometimes when you have done the best for nature on site, sometimes you can get some really interesting strategic wins by well-placed offsets in that immediate locality. So I always don't think, you know, offsite tend to get a bad rap, but sometimes they can have some good, you know, good outcomes.
Perfect, thanks. I've got a few more technical questions now. So does UK Hab allow you to search habitat indigenous species by postcode like a mapping tool, or do you have any other tools that can do that?
Oh gosh, no, so UK Hab is a classification. You can buy habitat data from local record centres. So they always have habitat layers on them. I don't think they are UK Habs yet. The ones I've seen haven't. I think they're still in either phase 1 or a basic habitat classification. And for those of you who know DEFRA's mapping website, it's called Magic, and that has environmental data on there. Some of those have habitat layers on that, but it's pretty crude. You know, it won't be for that basis. You can then translate those habitats into metric habitats, but I would get an ecologist involved with that translation and make sure that you justify that. You know, that comes back to, is that the right habitat metric? So you can certainly buy or look at freely available habitat maps. If you then need to translate that into the metric, yeah, just get an ecologist on board.
Great, thank you. We've got a question on the drivers now, which is quite interesting. So for developments that are currently using the metric, what would you say the driver is if it's not required by planning for a couple of years still?
I think it's interesting, under the NPPF published in 2019, that actually gave local planning authorities powers to stipulate net gain as part of planning. So they don't have to wait for the Environment Act. They can, and many of them are. The ones are the ones with ecology resources to do so. So, you know, we have this unequal mix throughout the country, and that's why I think it's a good time now for the Environment Act to come in and create that level playing field, you know, because it's unfair. You could be working in one local authority with net gain who's got an ecologist, and you don't have to do net gain over here. So there is, under NPPF, there's the local planning authorities can stipulate net gain requirements. Many organisations have voluntarily committed to net gain, I think, in a recognition that this is a key part of what sustainable development truly is. You know, we can't keep going with development given consent with biodiversity loss. We're seeing the payback, we really are, in terms of, you know, climate change, in terms of extreme weather events. It's just not sustainable. And I don't know about anyone else, but I still want my job, and my job is within infrastructure development. So we've got to become more sustainable as an industry to thrive. I mean, it's simply business sense.
Great. I think you've just kind of covered this one a bit, but do local planning authorities have the resource and skills to ensure these measures are carried out, and who is to police this? I guess that kind of depends on the authority, as you've just said.
Yeah, it's huge. This simply won't work if there's not the government support for that. And I have been involved, and I know local people within DEFRA are looking at the support, the resources, the training, the capabilities for local planning authorities. What I would say is that there's a time lag. There's a time lag to get people in, to train them up if they need training. I mean, there are some amazing people out there already who certainly really experienced and experts in this, but there is a time lag. Now we've got a 2-year, well, we've already started this 2-year period isn't 2 years to get ready for the Environment Act. It's 2 years to understand from DEFRA what is the ask, and we don't have that yet. We don't have details on secondary legislation. B, prepare and upskill ourselves as an industry, and C, make sure the regulators, the local planning authorities, local natural England teams are also skilled and not ready. So the clock is already ticking, and it's huge. You know, it's really, really important. But that's why I think collectively as an industry, if we can get the concept of net gain, it's about habitats. It really is. And if we can start building in and sharing case studies, good practice, things that we could do better, I think collectively, you know, we'll make strides to really get there. Oh, and who will enforce that? We don't know yet. We don't have the details from government about secondary legislation. So I kind of watch this space for now.